In this fifth video in this series on human dignity, we're going to look at the Church's teaching on immigration. Specifically, we're going to look at how Pope Francis frames the Church's teaching on the rights of immigrants within the context of the principle of the universal destination of goods, which I covered in the last video. So I'm going to start with the Catechism. The Catechism in paragraph 2241 lays out in a pretty succinct way the Church's teaching on the right to immigrate. It says this: the more prosperous nations are obliged, to the extent that they are able, to welcome the foreigner in search of the security and the means of livelihood which he cannot find in his country of origin. Public authorities should see to it that the natural right is respected that places a guest under the protection of those who receive him. The Catechism goes on and says, political authorities, for the sake of the common good for which they are responsible, may make the exercise of the right to immigrate subject to various juridical conditions. Here we see the Church teaches that people have a right to immigrate and that states also have the right to regulate immigration across their borders for the sake of the common good. I have seen this passage misused in a whole number of different ways. I've seen it used specifically to defend the state having the right to regulate its borders however it wants. And that is very explicitly not what this teaching says. I've seen it misused in a way very similar to the way that the Church's teaching on private property can be misused to justify people using their private property however they wish. In his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis corrects this misinterpretation by grounding the right to immigrate in the universal destination of goods. He says this: nowadays, a firm belief in the common destination of the earth's goods requires that this principle also be applied to nations, their territories, and their resources. Seen from the standpoint not only of the legitimacy of private property and the rights of its citizens, but also of the first principle of the common destination of goods, we can then say that each country also belongs to the foreigner, inasmuch as a territory's goods must not be denied to a needy person coming from elsewhere. This is an incredible teaching coming from Pope Francis. And I believe that by invoking the principle of the universal destination of goods, Pope Francis was inviting the Church to view the relationship between the right to immigrate and the state's ability to regulate its borders with the universal destination of goods and the right to private property. I think there's three ways that these teachings mirror each other. First is, just as private property and the universal destination of goods are not in competition with each other, neither is the teaching on national borders and the right to immigrate in competition with each other. Rather, the ability of the state to regulate its borders is in service to the right to immigrate, is in service to the common good. And this is explicit in that passage from the Catechism where it says, political authorities, for the sake of the common good for which they are responsible, may make the exercise of the right to immigrate subject to various juridical conditions. The right to regulate national borders is in service to the common good. Thus, any law that restricts the right to immigrate must serve the common good. That is, the right of every human being to have what they need materially to live a dignified life. It's clear that secure national borders, like private property, are not absolute rights. Rather, they are the means to an end of facilitating the rights of all persons access to the resources and security they need to live a dignified life. This understanding of Church teaching was reaffirmed in a joint statement between the USCCB, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the Conference of Bishops in Mexico. They wrote a document titled Strangers No Longer, Together on the Journey of Hope. And in that document, they say this: the Church recognizes the right of a sovereign state to control its borders in furtherance of the common good. It also recognizes the right of human persons to migrate so that they can realize their God-given rights. These teachings complement each other. While the sovereign state may impose reasonable limits on immigration, the common good is not served when the basic human rights of the individual are violated. In the current condition of the world, in which global poverty and persecution are rampant, the presumption is that persons must migrate in order to support and protect themselves, and that nations who are able to receive them should do so whenever possible. In comparing the right to immigrate and the universal destination of goods, there's a second thing I think Pope Francis is drawing our attention to. Because the goods of the earth belong to everyone, like I talked about in the video last week, if a starving parent steals a loaf of bread in order to feed themselves and their child, they aren't actually stealing in the Church's teaching. As I said last week, they are taking what is rightfully theirs from the excess of somebody else. It isn't just they aren't culpable because of their desperate circumstance, it's that they're not stealing in the first place. Likewise, if a foreigner in search of a place to live a dignified life is being unjustly prevented from legally immigrating into the United States, for example, and therefore enters illegally, they aren't violating the moral law any more than the parent stealing a loaf of bread is violating the moral law. This is because, to quote Pope Francis, each country also belongs to the foreigner. Or as Bishop Thomas Wensky put it, they, people who are immigrating illegally, they are not breaking the law. The law is breaking them. One principle that I was formed in early on as a teenager and young adult being in the pro-life movement, and that is clear across church teaching, is that just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's morally good. And if it comes down to it, I must obey what is morally right, even if it means disobeying the law. This principle applies here. The third way I believe Pope Francis is inviting us to consider the Church's teaching on immigration by invoking the principle of the universal destination of goods is that the state sometimes has the right, with private property, to redistribute excess wealth in order for everyone to live a dignified life. However, the state shouldn't have to. As Pope Francis said, helping the poor financially must always be a provisional solution in the face of pressing need. The broader objective should always be to allow people to live a dignified life through work. The state shouldn't have to redistribute wealth, because people should already be living a virtuous enough life. Society should already be virtuous enough that everyone should have access to dignified work and a dignified income. But that's not the case, and because that's not the case, the state has to redistribute wealth. Likewise, concerning immigration, Pope Francis said in Fratelli Tutti, ideally, unnecessary migration ought to be avoided. This entails creating in countries of origin the conditions needed for a dignified life and integral development. Yet until substantial progress is made in achieving this goal, we are obliged to respect the right of all individuals to find a place that meets their basic needs and those of their families, and where they can find personal fulfillment. Our response to the arrival of migrating persons can be summarized by 4 words: welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. In other words, no one should feel forced to leave their homeland in order to live a dignified life. They should be able to live a dignified life in their homeland. They have a right not to migrate. However, until that ideal is achieved, we are obliged to respect the rights of people to seek the location and resources they need, to seek the safety and resources they need to live a dignified life. By rooting the right to migrate within the principle of the universal destination of goods, Pope Francis is showing us that when we value national borders over the infinite dignity of every single human being, we are allowing secondary rights, to quote from Fratelli Tutti, to displace primary and overriding rights, in practice, making those primary rights irrelevant.